The snow came down in sheets that Tuesday morning, blanketing Boston in a silence so complete it felt almost deliberate, as though the city itself had decided to hold its breath. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Hamilton Group's 42nd floor, flakes swirled and tumbled against the glass, pressed flat for a moment before the wind carried them away into the white expanse below. The boardroom was immaculate, all clean lines and polished surfaces, the kind of room designed to communicate power without ever having to say the word aloud. And it was in that room, as the last agenda item was checked off and leather portfolios clicked shut around the long mahogany table, that Victoria Hamilton did something she almost never did. She stopped a man she barely knew and said something that silenced every person still in the building. She looked at him the way she looked at everything, directly, without apology, and said, "My father said you needed a wife." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. A junior associate near the door forgot to finish gathering her papers. Two senior directors exchanged a glance they immediately tried to disguise as nothing, and the man himself, Ethan Carter, 42 years old, wearing a coat that had seen better winters, stood very still for a moment. Then, quietly, he smiled, and the answer he gave next was one that Victoria Hamilton, in all her years of boardrooms and negotiations and calculated conversations, had never once anticipated. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she had nothing to say. Ethan Carter was not the kind of man who announced himself when he walked into a room. He carried no visible markers of distinction, no tailored suit, no practiced confidence, no deliberate performance of importance. He drove a 10-year-old Subaru with a small crack in the rear bumper that he'd been meaning to fix for 2 winters now. And he lived in a house on the outskirts of Boston that was modest by any measure, set back from a quiet street where the maples had grown tall enough to close their canopies overhead in summer. In winter, they were bare, and the house looked exposed in a way that might have seemed lonely to a passing stranger. Ethan did not find it lonely. He had come to understand, over the years, that quiet and loneliness were not the same thing, no matter how often people confused them. He was 42, a widower, and he had been living inside the particular stillness of that fact for 6 years. His wife, Claire, had died of an illness that moved too quickly for anyone to properly prepare, and the grief that followed had reshaped him in ways he hadn't always been able to name. He had not crumbled, that wasn't the word for it. He had contracted, in the way that things do when they lose something central, pulled inward toward a smaller, quieter version of himself. He had sold the house they'd shared in Cambridge. He had declined a string of promotions. He had let friendships go quiet the way you let a fire go out when you're too tired to feed it. And eventually, he had found his way to the suburbs, to the maple-lined street, to the small house where he had rebuilt something that, if not entirely whole, was at least genuinely his. He had been, once, a structural engineer of real distinction. His firm had designed bridges that would outlast everyone alive to admire them. He had understood loads and tensions and the invisible architecture of force the way some people understood language intuitively, in his bones. But that life had belonged to a version of himself that felt increasingly remote, like a photograph of someone who resembled him closely but was not quite him. He still consulted, occasionally, when the work interested him enough. That was why he had come to Boston that Tuesday, navigating the snow-heavy streets in the Subaru, finding his way to the Hamilton Group's tower with the unhurried ease of a man who knew that being slightly early and slightly underdressed was the most honest thing he could offer. He had parked in the public garage 2 blocks away, declined the offer of an umbrella from the lobby concierge, and ridden the elevator to the 42nd floor, with his hands in the pockets of his gray wool coat. Several people in the elevator had taken brief inventory of him and concluded, accurately, that he was not important in any immediately legible way. What they had failed to notice, and what would only become clear later, was that 3 of the company's most senior directors had greeted him by name when he stepped out of the elevator, and that one of them, a man who had been with Hamilton Group for 20 years, had shaken his hand with both of his own, the way you do when gratitude has never fully found the right words. Victoria Hamilton saw none of this. She arrived at the boardroom late, which she almost never did, having spent the previous 40 minutes on a call with a Brussels office that could not seem to understand the meaning of the phrase, final decision. She slid into her seat at the head of the table, scanned the room once, and registered Ethan Carter as the man in the coat who was probably the structural consultant her assistant had mentioned. She did not think of him again for the duration of the meeting, which was itself unusual. Victoria had a habit of cataloging people the moment she entered a room, filing them under useful or not useful, with the brisk efficiency of someone who had learned early that attention was a finite resource. Ethan Carter, filed under consultant, pending assessment, sat near the far end of the table and offered his analysis when it was requested clearly, without preamble, with a precision that several people in the room found quietly arresting, though they might not have been able to say exactly why. Victoria Hamilton was 38 years old and had been the CEO of Hamilton Group for 4 years, having taken the role when her father's health had made it necessary, and then having made herself impossible to replace through the simple force of being exceptionally good at the job. She was tall, with the kind of self-possession that people sometimes mistook for coldness. And she had learned a long time ago not to correct that impression. Coldness was useful. It created space. It kept the conversations focused on things that mattered, which was always preferable to the alternative. She was not, by nature's plank, without feeling. She had simply learned to store her feelings in a place where they would not interfere with her judgment, the way you might store important documents somewhere safe, precisely because you cannot afford to lose them. The result was a woman who inspired a great deal of professional admiration and rather less personal warmth, which suited her reasonably well most of the time. The times it did not suit her, she did not discuss with anyone. Her father, Richard Hamilton, was 71 and had been stepping back from the company by degrees for the past 3 years, the way a man does when he is trying to believe he is not stepping back at all. He still kept an office on the 38th floor. He still came in 3 days a week, sometimes 4. He still had opinions about everything, which he expressed with the confident authority of a man who had built something from the ground up and expected the world to have the decency to remember it. Victoria did not always agree with her father. She always listened to him. There was a distinction, and she had spent years learning to hold it. Richard Hamilton had been talking about Ethan Carter for the better part of 2 months. This was not, in itself, unusual. Her father tended to become attached to people he found interesting, and then to circle back to them in conversation long after Victoria had considered the subject closed. But the frequency and intensity of his focus on Ethan had exceeded even his usual patterns, and it was beginning to feel less like an old man's fondness and more like something deliberate. "He's a remarkable person," Richard had said, not once but 4 or 5 times, each time with the particular emphasis of someone who knows they are not being fully believed and is determining whether to push harder or let the evidence accumulate. "I don't use that word loosely, Victoria. You know I don't." She did know that. Her father was not a man who used words loosely. He was precise in the way that people are when they have spent their lives understanding that imprecision costs money, and, sometimes, more than money. So she had listened, and she had nodded, and she had made the appropriate sounds of acknowledgement, and privately she had filed Ethan Carter under whatever her father's latest project was, and moved on to the next item. "He saved this company," Richard told her, one evening in his study, without any particular preamble. The fire was going. Outside the windows of his Beacon Hill townhouse, snow was just beginning to fall. A few early flakes catching the lamplight from the street. Not in a way that shows up in any report, not in a way that anyone ever announced, but the company you are running right now exists because of a decision he made, at a moment when most people would have made a very different one. Victoria had looked at her father then, really looked at him. The way she rarely allowed herself to do, because looking at her father clearly meant acknowledging things she preferred to hold at arm's length. "What decision?" she said. "The right one," Richard said. And then he stared into the fire and did not say anything else for a long while. She had tried, after that evening, to find the details herself. She was not someone who waited for information to arrive at her convenience. She went and got it, which was one of the reasons she was good at her job. She started with the company's financial records from 8 years back, pulling up archived documents in her father's old filing system, cross-referencing the dates he had implied with the transaction logs she had access to. She was thorough because she was always thorough, and she did it late on a Tuesday night, when the office was empty, and the building hummed with the particular quiet of an organization temporarily at rest. But the records she could access told her very little. And the people she spoke to were oddly reluctant. Not evasive exactly, but careful in a way that suggested they were protecting something they considered worth protecting. She found references to a consulting arrangement from 8 years ago, a critical moment in the company's finances, a structural problem with a development project that had been quietly resolved before it could become public. There was a single invoice, modest in number relative to the scope of work it represented, and a brief memo from her father's executive assistant that read only, "The Carter matter resolved. No further documentation, no press release, no recognition." Beyond that, the trail went soft. What she did find, in the course of her searching, was a picture of Ethan Carter that she had not expected. He had founded his own engineering firm in his early 30s, Carter Structural Group, based in Cambridge, a boutique operation with a reputation that far exceeded its size. They had worked on projects across the Northeast, mostly large-scale commercial and civic structures, the kind of work that demands both technical sophistication and genuine creative vision. The firm had been profitable. More than profitable, it had been the kind of quiet success that certain people in the industry spoke about with a mixture of respect and something close to envy, the envy you feel for someone who has made difficult things look effortless. She found an article from an engineering trade publication, 7 years old now, that called Carter Structural Group one of the most innovative small practices in New England. The photograph that accompanied it showed a younger Ethan at a job site, wearing a hard hat and looking at something off camera with the expression of a man solving a problem he finds genuinely interesting. She looked at the photograph longer than she intended to, and then, 7 years ago, the firm had been dissolved. Not acquired, not merged, dissolved. Ethan had sold off the assets and walked away from something it had taken him a decade to build, and he had done it without any public explanation, without any announcement, with the same absence of performance that seemed to characterize everything else she was discovering about him. The people who had worked for him were, to a person, unwilling to say anything against him. More than that, they seemed genuinely reluctant to say anything at all, as though whatever understanding they had reached with him was one they still considered binding. "He's one of the best I've ever worked with," one of his former engineers had told her, when she finally reached him by phone. Technically, yes. But more than that, you always knew where you stood with him. You always knew what mattered to him. She had asked why he'd closed the firm. There was a pause. "That's his to explain," the man had said. Not unkindly. "I don't think it's mine." She had hung up the phone and sat for a moment with the particular feeling of having gotten closer to something without quite reaching it. Then she had gone back to her schedule, and the rest of the day had closed over the feeling the way water closes over a stone. The morning of the board meeting, Victoria arrived to find Ethan already in the small conference room adjacent to the boardroom, going over the structural analysis documents he'd been brought in to review. He had a pencil in his hand, which she found faintly anachronistic, and he was making small notations in the margins of the pages, with the focused economy of a man who has long since abandoned any interest in performing diligence for an audience. He looked up when she entered, nodded, and looked back down. She had expected, on some level, for him to react to her the way most people did, a slight adjustment of posture, a brightening of attention, the invisible recalibration that happened when people recognized who she was and revised their behavior accordingly. He did not adjust, did not brighten, did not revise. He simply went back to his pencil and his pages, and she found herself standing in the doorway for a moment longer than she'd intended. "The foundation analysis on the Northgate project," she said, "because saying something was preferable to standing there. I understand you have concerns." "Two," he said, without looking up. "The Eastern load-bearing calculations assume soil composition data that's 12 years old, and the drainage design doesn't account for the freeze-thaw cycle in that specific corridor. Both are fixable. Neither is catastrophic. But if you break ground in spring without addressing them, you'll have problems before the first winter is out." She processed this. The engineering team signed off on those plans. I know. He did look up then, briefly. Good team. They were working with the information they had. The issue is the information. It was a precise answer. It was a fair answer. It was also, she noticed, an answer that declined to place blame anywhere it didn't belong, which was not the kind of answer she usually got when she asked a consultant to assess another team's work. Consultants generally found it more commercially advantageous to make the problem sound larger, and the existing team look less capable than the situation actually warranted. Ethan had simply described what was true, without editorial comment. She found it, against her expectation, slightly disarming. The board meeting itself proceeded without incident. Ethan presented his findings with the same quality she had observed in the side room: concise, accurate, unbothered by the room's considerable aggregate ego. When a senior director pushed back on one of his assessments, he listened, acknowledged what was valid, and maintained what he believed without becoming either defensive or conciliatory in the dishonest way. The director, to his credit, eventually came around. Victoria watched this exchange with attention she did not try to hide. Because, in a room full of people watching for the impression they were making, watching the room was almost invisible. It was after the meeting, when the room had mostly emptied, and she found herself still at the head of the table with Ethan collecting his documents at the far end, that something moved through her that she recognized, uncomfortably, as an impulse. And before her more deliberate self could organize a reason against it, she was already crossing the room. And the words were already in the air. My father said you needed a wife. She had meant it, she told herself later, as a kind of conversation opener, a way of surfacing what was actually happening, of naming her father's transparent maneuvering, so that they could acknowledge it like adults, and move past the awkwardness. She had not fully considered how it would sound, until she heard it in her own voice, hanging in the air of the emptying boardroom with its particular mixture of wealth and fluorescence, and recognized immediately that it sounded exactly as presumptuous as it was. The two people still remaining an associate gathering cables, a director reaching for his forgotten reading glasses, both went very still. Ethan stopped collecting his documents. He looked at her with the same unhurried attention he had given the structural plans, the same quality of looking that did not seem to require her to be anything in particular in order to receive it. Then he smiled. Not the polite, managed smile of professional accommodation, something quieter than that, and warmer, and entirely his own. Then he said, I don't need a wife. The room absorbed this. Victoria held his gaze, waiting, because she could hear in his voice that he wasn't finished. I need someone who sees me before my loneliness. She had prepared, in the half-second after her own words landed, for a variety of responses. Surprise, perhaps. Flattered discomfort. The slightly dazed acquiescence of someone who cannot quite believe they are being presented with such an extraordinary opportunity. What she had not prepared for, what she had not considered, had genuinely not constructed a single response for, was the clean, undefended simplicity of what he actually said. It was not a rejection, not precisely. It was something more specific than that. It was a description of a kind of seeing that she was suddenly not entirely sure she was capable of. Too many people look at me and see a man who has lost something, he said, gathering his papers again, folding them into the leather portfolio without haste. They decide what I need based on what's missing. I understand it. I've done the same to other people. But it's not the same as knowing someone. He glanced at her. Your father means well. He's one of the best people I know, but what he described, that's not something someone can arrange. Victoria was quiet. This itself was unusual enough that the associate near the door glanced up. I'm sorry, she said finally. That was an intrusive thing to say. He considered this with the seriousness it apparently deserved. It was an honest thing, he said, which is not the same as intrusive. I'd rather people said what they were thinking. He closed the portfolio and lifted his coat from the back of the chair. Your father talks about you too. He's proud of what you've built. He looked at her once more, simply, without agenda. Have a safe drive home. Roads are bad. Then he walked out, and she stood at the head of the empty boardroom and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the specific sensation of being seen without being known, and the specific absence of those two things being the same. She called her father that evening from the car, idling in the parking garage while snow moved in heavy curtains across the ramp entrance. The conversation that followed lasted 40 minutes, which was longer than most of her conversations with Richard Hamilton. And she asked questions she had not previously allowed herself to ask, and her father answered them in a voice that made him sound, somehow, both older and more like himself than he usually did. He told her about the winter 8 years ago, when the Hamilton Group's largest development project had collapsed around a concealed environmental liability that the original developers had buried in the due diligence paperwork. The company had been exposed to losses that would have ended it. Not damaged, ended. Richard had been 63, with everything he'd built suddenly vulnerable, and the lawyers had given him a range of options that all led, by different paths, to the same place. Then, Ethan Carter had sat across from him in a conference room and laid out a structural and financial analysis so thorough, so genuinely imaginative in its approach to the problem, that Richard had seen, for the first time, a way out that did not require either dishonesty or defeat. Ethan had worked with the company's team for 11 weeks. He had put in hours that Richard could not have compensated at any reasonable rate. And at the end of it, when the liability had been restructured and absorbed, and the company was standing again on its own foundation, Ethan had declined the equity stake Richard offered. He had declined the bonus. He had declined the advisory retainer, the board seat, the professional association that would have opened doors for his own firm that money alone could not have bought. I asked him why, Richard said. He said the work was good work. He said solving that problem had been worth his time. He said he had what he needed. Victoria sat in the dark car and let the engine run. And his firm? A pause. Claire was diagnosed that autumn, 2 months after he finished the Hamilton work. He spent the next year with her. He dissolved the firm so that he could. Richard was quiet for a moment. He never asked anyone for anything. He's never suggested, in all the years since, that he was owed. He just kept showing up. When I've needed someone to think clearly, he's been that person, and he's never made it a transaction. Victoria stared through the windshield at the falling snow. Why did you tell me he needed a wife? Her father was quiet long enough that she thought the call might have dropped. Then, because I was wrong, he said. And because I think what he actually needs is too specific for me to name. I thought perhaps if I was obvious enough, you'd push back hard enough to go find out for yourself. He sounded, faintly, like he was smiling. I've been doing this long enough to know that you never do anything anyone tells you to do. So sometimes I tell you to do the wrong thing. She did not speak to Ethan Carter for 11 days after that. She thought about him more often than she would have liked. In the way you think about something that has lodged itself in a place your usual processes cannot quite reach. She thought about what he'd said in the boardroom. I need someone who sees me before my loneliness, and she understood it. In the same way you understand a piece of music you've only heard once, incompletely, and with the nagging sense that you've missed something important. She also, in the privacy of her own recollection, examined her behavior in the boardroom and found it lacking. Not catastrophically, she was not given to catastrophizing, but honestly. She had gone to Ethan Carter with her father's words as a kind of instrument. And she had not stopped to consider, even briefly, what it might mean to be on the receiving end of that. She had been thoughtless in the particular way of someone who has so long been in the position of defining the terms of every room she entered that she had stopped noticing she was doing it. She stood on her apartment balcony one evening in that 11-day period, with a glass of wine she wasn't really drinking and the city spread out below her in its winter illumination, and she thought about the version of herself she had been at 25, before the company was hers to carry. She had been curious then, in a way that had nothing to do with strategy. She had been capable of being surprised. She had once spent an entire afternoon in the Gardner Museum, wandering through rooms she had no appointment to visit, because something on the 3rd floor had stopped her in the middle of a thought and held her there for 20 minutes, in a way she could not have justified to anyone, and had not tried to. She could not remember the last time she had done something like that. Somewhere along the way, she had decided that surprise was a vulnerability, and had reorganized herself accordingly, and the version of herself that stood on the balcony was efficient and capable and respected, and also profoundly certain of things she was no longer sure deserved that certainty. She had never, she realized, been in a room with someone who made her feel underprepared without intending to. Ethan Carter had not been trying to unsettle her. He had simply been himself, steadily and without concession, and the effect of encountering that when you were accustomed to people adjusting themselves around you was stranger than she would have predicted. She thought about the two remaining people in the boardroom, the associate and the director, the way they had both gone still when Ethan spoke, not because he had raised his voice or deployed some visible authority, because he had said something real, in a room where most things said were careful, and it had created a sudden, clarifying silence, the way truth sometimes does, when it arrives without warning in a place not built for it. She called him on a Wednesday. She said she wanted to follow up on the Northgate assessment, which was true enough to count as a reason. They met at a coffee shop near South Station, somewhere with enough ambient noise to make silence feel less deliberate. He was there before her, which she had not expected. He had coffee, and he did not have his phone out, which was the kind of detail you noticed only when it was absent. He stood when she came in, not performatively, just the easy courtesy of someone who had been raised with it, and they settled across from each other in the kind of booth where the light was yellow and the tables were slightly uneven and no one was performing anything for anyone. She started with Northgate and the soil data. He walked her through it with the same clarity he'd brought to the boardroom, answering her questions in the way that assumed she was capable of following, which she found, unexpectedly, pleasant. Most people modified their language when they spoke to her, some condescendingly upward, some diplomatically downward. Almost all of them aware, on some level, of the audience they were addressing. Ethan spoke to her the way he probably spoke to anyone, and the simplicity of it was more refreshing than she could entirely account for. After a while, they moved away from Northgate. She asked him about his firm. He told her about it without nostalgia, but with obvious affection, the work they'd done, the problems they'd solved, the quality of the people he'd worked alongside. She asked, carefully, why he'd dissolved it. He looked at his coffee for a moment. Claire got sick, he said. Once I understood what that meant, what the timeline was, everything else reorganized itself pretty quickly. He looked up. The firm needed someone who could be fully present. I couldn't be both things. The choice wasn't hard. You gave up a great deal, Victoria said. I gave up a business, he said, with a precision that was not defensive. What I had with Claire, what I was able to be with her at the end, that wasn't a great deal. That was everything. He paused. I don't say that to make it sound larger than it is. I just mean the math was simple. People make it complicated because they're trying to avoid the choice. The choice itself is usually obvious. Victoria considered this. Most people would have found a way to do both. Most people would have told themselves they were doing both while doing neither very well, he said, without heat. I've met a lot of people who are very good at the story they tell about the choices they've made. I'd rather make the choice and live with what it actually cost. He looked at her steadily. You know this. You've made choices that cost you things. Probably more than you let on. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, a delivery truck moved through the street, parting the falling snow. My father says I've made the company my life. Has he said that as a compliment or as a concern? Both, she said. At different times, sometimes in the same sentence. Ethan nodded, as though this were the most ordinary thing in the world, which perhaps it was. He loves you, he said simply. He worries that you've built a life that doesn't have enough room for the things that don't show up on a balance sheet. He held his coffee cup in both hands. I'm not in a position to know whether he's right, but I think the fact that you're asking the question means something. She had not, she noticed, said she was asking the question. He had intuited it, or simply seen it, in the way he seemed to see things without making a performance of the looking. She found, sitting across from him in the uneven light of the coffee shop, that she was not uncomfortable with being seen. That was unusual enough to be worth paying attention to. "I owe you an apology," she said, "for what I said." In the boardroom, he tilted his head slightly. "You don't, particularly. You were honest about what your father had told you. And you said it in a way that was more direct than tactful. And both of those things I can respect. What would have bothered me is if you'd been less honest. If you'd come at it sideways, managed it." He looked at her. "You're not a sideways person. That's worth something. I was careless with it," she said. "I didn't think about how it would land." "No," he agreed. "But you're thinking about it now. That counts for more, in my experience, than getting it right the first time." She was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee cup in her hands. "What did you mean?" she said finally. "When you said you needed someone who sees you before your loneliness." He didn't answer immediately. He was the kind of person, she was beginning to understand, who did not fill silence with noise just because the silence was there. "I meant that most people who want to help me," he said, "after a while, start from a picture of what they think is wrong. They see a man who lives alone, who doesn't have much, who gave things up, and they write a story about loss. And then they try to fix that story. But the story they're fixing isn't mine." He looked at her, and his gaze was not difficult to receive. "I'm not unhappy. I'm not waiting to be rescued. I have a life that is exactly what I chose, and the only people who can't see that are the ones who can't imagine choosing it." He paused. "What I want, if I want anything, and I'm not sure I spend much time on wanting, is someone who looks at me and sees a person before they see a condition." Victoria set down her cup. Outside, the snow had gentled. "I think I've been very good at seeing conditions," she said, "and less good at seeing people." "You see people," he said. "You're doing it right now." He didn't make it a compliment, exactly. He said it like a fact. "You've been trained to read rooms and assess stakes, and sometimes that training runs in front of the person underneath it. That's not the same as being incapable. It's just a habit that got bigger than you intended." She thought about that on the drive home. She thought about it at her desk the next morning, and in the meeting after that, and in the brief, valuable silence of the elevator between floors. She thought about the habits that had gotten bigger than she intended: the catalog of assessments, the strategic patience, the careful management of what she let in and what she kept at a useful distance. She thought about her father's voice on the phone, admitting that he'd been deliberately oblique, and she thought about the particular quality of love that would maneuver like that. Inelegantly, but with such transparent intention, because it did not know how else to say, "I want more for you than this." She called Richard the following afternoon. She told him about the coffee shop conversation. Not all of it, but enough. He listened without interrupting, which was not his natural mode. And when she finished, there was a long pause. "You like him," Richard said. "I think he's a good person," she said carefully. "Victoria." There was, unmistakably, a smile in her father's voice. "You like him." She did not confirm this. She also did not deny it, which in her father's taxonomy was as good as confirmation. "He's not what I expected," she said. "He says exactly what he means. He doesn't adjust himself for the room." "No," Richard said. "He never has." "It's strange," she said, "to be in a conversation where no one is managing anything." "Is it?" Richard said. "Is it strange? Or is it just unfamiliar?" She thought about this for long enough that the question probably answered itself. "Dad," she said, "why didn't you just tell me the story, the real story, the company, 8 years ago, what he did?" Her father was quiet for a moment. "Because knowing what someone did isn't the same as knowing who they are. I didn't want you to approach him with a debt. I didn't want you to be grateful. I wanted you to be interested." A pause. "Besides, he never told me what to say. He just kept being himself. I thought maybe, if I put you in the same room long enough, you'd do the work yourself." She did not tell Ethan, the next time they spoke, that her father had admitted to engineering the meeting, the repeated mentions, the boardroom encounter. She thought about telling him. She sat with the impulse for several days, turning it over, the way you turn over a decision that is not urgent but is not nothing, and she concluded that some things were better received as lived experience than as explained narrative. Her father had been transparent enough in his intentions perhaps from the very beginning, perhaps even intending for her to see through it, knowing that Victoria would investigate precisely because she had been told not to bother. What mattered was not the mechanism but the conversation it had produced. And the conversations after that, and the particular quality of attention she found herself applying to a person she would otherwise have filed, assessed, and moved past. She decided that Ethan Carter, of all the people she had met, would understand this distinction without needing it spelled out. He was not someone who required the infrastructure of a thing to be explained once the thing itself was already present. They had lunch the following week, at a place near the waterfront, where the windows faced the harbor, and the ice had formed thick plates along the pilings. They talked for 2 hours, which surprised her. She was not someone who spent 2 hours in unscheduled conversation, not because she was unwilling, but because there was always something that needed her attention more urgently than the person in front of her. But she had told her assistant she would be back at 3, and she was back at 3. And the 2 hours between lunch and 3 o'clock were the least pressured she could remember spending in a professional context, except that by that point, it no longer felt like a professional context. He told her about his daughter, Lily, who was 14 and deeply interested in marine biology, who could name every species of sea turtle in the western Atlantic and had opinions about ocean acidification that she expressed with the ferocity of the recently informed. She had started writing letters, actual handwritten letters to marine conservation organizations, and had received 2 responses that she had pinned to the board above her desk, with a seriousness he found both touching and completely characteristic. He talked about her with the uncomplicated love of someone who has not, even for a moment, resented what she had cost him. His whole face changed when he talked about her. Not dramatically. He was not a dramatic person, but in the way that the quality of light changes when a cloud moves. Something opening without fanfare. She asks questions I can't answer, he said, which is the best possible thing, in my experience. It means she's going to go looking. He said this with a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with pride in the conventional sense. No reference to achievement or trajectory or what Lily might become. Only the uncomplicated pleasure of watching someone he loved becoming herself. Victoria found herself thinking about what it would be like to have someone talk about her that way. Not with pride. Exactly, she received professional pride regularly, and it was pleasant, but not particularly nourishing. But with that specific quality of uncalculated warmth. The way you talk about someone when you have forgotten, for a moment, that other people are listening. She told him about the company, not the executive summary version she gave journalists, but the version that included the years when she had not been sure she was right for the role, the early period when everything she decided seemed to have consequences she had not fully thought through. And she had lain awake calibrating and recalibrating, and arrived at work exhausted, and gave nothing of that away. He listened the way he looked at things completely, without commentary, without trying to reach a solution. She realized, somewhere in the middle of a sentence, that she could not remember the last time she had told that story to anyone. "Why did you take the role?" he asked, when she finished. Not the official answer. The real one, she considered. "Because my father was afraid," she said. "And because I couldn't bear to watch him be afraid and do nothing." She looked at her water glass. "And because I thought I believed that I could hold it together, that if I was rigorous enough, careful enough, if I applied enough of myself to it, nothing would fall apart." A pause, which is a reasonable belief for a company, and a very inadequate belief for everything else. "Everything else is harder to engineer," he said. "Yes," she said, "it really is." The snow had all but stopped by the time they left the restaurant. The harbor was flat and gray, the ice motionless against the pilings, and the sky had the pale, luminous quality of a winter afternoon that might, if you waited long enough, give way to something. They walked a short distance along the waterfront without having particularly agreed to, the way you do when a conversation has developed enough inertia that stopping it feels like a choice that would need to be made consciously. The cold was real, but the wind had settled, and the harbor was very still. And there was something in the quality of a Boston winter afternoon, its gray directness, the way it stripped away the decorative and left only the structural that felt appropriate to the kind of conversation they had been having, the kind that proceeds not by design, but by a shared willingness to continue wherever it leads. An older couple passed them going the other direction, their shoulders touching, not talking, inhabiting a comfortable silence that had obviously been built over years. Victoria watched them for a moment after they passed, and did not say what she was thinking. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes. Do you ever regret it? Leaving the firm, giving up what you gave up?" He walked for a moment before answering. "I regret that Claire got sick," he said. "I regret that Lily grew up without her mother. I regret the years Claire and I didn't know about each other, when we were too young and too busy, and thought we had all the time that people always think they have." He looked ahead, at the frozen water. "I don't regret the 11 weeks I spent on the Hamilton work, because that was good work, and I'm glad I could do it. And I don't regret dissolving the firm, because by the time I made that decision, it was already clear what the only important thing was." He glanced at her. "You want to know if I look back and see a different life I could have had?" "I do. But it doesn't feel like loss, it feels like the shape of this one. Like the way a riverbed is shaped by the water that's been through it." They stopped at the end of the walkway, where the boards ended, and a low railing looked out over the harbor. The light was doing the thing it does in winter, going sideways rather than straight down, filling everything at an angle that made the ice and the buildings and the bare trees along the waterfront all look slightly more themselves than usual. "I've spent a long time," Victoria said, "evaluating things for their utility, including people." She was quiet for a moment. "I think I've missed things." "You've also built things," he said. "Those aren't contradictory. My father thinks I need more than what I've built." Ethan looked at her. With that quality she had by now come to expect from him, not calculating, not cautious, simply present. "Your father loves you," he said. "And he is occasionally right about things." She laughed, which surprised her. It was a genuine laugh, not a managed one. And it startled a pair of pigeons on the railing, who made their objections known and moved along the harbor. "Was he right?" she said carefully. "That you needed someone?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then, "I think I needed someone to stop treating my life like a problem to be solved." He looked at the water. "And maybe to have a conversation that went somewhere neither of us could have planned." "Has this gone somewhere neither of us could have planned?" "Several places," he said, and there was something in the corner of his voice that was not quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. She found him the next week, on a Thursday morning, at the coffee shop near South Station. He was there before her again. He had 2 coffees, which she noticed, and he pushed one across the table when she sat down, which she noticed more. They talked about Lily's science fair project, and about a bridge assessment Ethan had been asked to consult on in Providence, and about a book he was reading that she had read 3 years ago and still thought about, and eventually they talked about nothing in particular, which was, she was finding, its own kind of conversation. 2 weeks later, on a Saturday when the sky had the clear, cold quality that follows a heavy snow, she texted him. She said, "Maybe my father was wrong." He texted back, after a few minutes. "About what?" She typed, "Maybe you didn't need a wife." Then she sat with her phone for a moment, and typed, "Maybe you just needed the right conversation." She set the phone down, and looked out the window, at the white-covered garden of her building, where the light was coming through clean and direct, the way it does in winter, when the clouds have finally moved on. He replied, after a minute, "Maybe that's true." And then, though I notice the conversation has become several conversations. She looked at that for a moment. And then, she was smiling, which was not a managed expression, and which she did not try to arrange into something more composed. The snow had stopped 2 days earlier. The streets were clear now, mostly, with the remnants of it pushed to the edges and beginning to recede. From her window, she could see the building across the street, its windows reflecting the morning light, and the bare trees along the sidewalk, and two people walking a dog, who was clearly delighted by whatever morning meant to a dog in winter. The city had the particular quality it gets when it comes back to itself after weather present, specific, its own, as though it had been briefly absent and had now returned, remembering everything. She was not a person who believed in the architecture of fate, in the idea that the significant moments of a life arrive according to some external design. She believed in choices, and in the consequences of choices, and in the possibility, remote but real, that two people might arrive in the same room at the same moment and find, to their mutual surprise, that they had more to say to each other than either of them had budgeted for. She picked up her phone and typed, "Yes, several." She paused, then added, "Good ones," and sent it before she thought about it too carefully, which was, she was realizing, perhaps the whole point. He replied with two words that she would think about, off and on, for the rest of that clear winter morning and into the afternoon. "Keep going."